So I will be reading a piece of my novel, The Book of Lost Light, that's fairly early in the book. It takes place in San Francisco in the late 1890s. And all you need to know is that Arthur Kylander is a portrait photographer who hasn't been into work since his wife died in childbirth 3 months ago. Corelia is his 13-year-old niece, recently arrived from a farm in Canada to help raise Arthur's infant son, Joseph. One morning in late September, less than 2 months after I entered the world, my father got up early and began shaving. Corelia had never seen him with a razor in his hand. When he emerged from the bathroom, she nearly didn't recognize him. He had shaven his beard off, and his skin glowed, the lines of his jaw sharp and pink. His drying hair stood out in damp ringlets. He said, as soon as possible, we must go to the studio. She wasn't accustomed to hearing him speak in such energetic tones, and it made her uneasy. And she had no idea where he was proposing they go. He had told her that he was on leave from his job as a portrait photographer, but she didn't connect the word studio to that profession, which remained as mysterious to her as when she had arrived. She changed and bottle fed me and ate her own breakfast. He held her coat for her. My father was tall, and she was hard pressed to keep pace with him, especially with me in her arms. They walked down Montgomery Avenue, past the barber's, past the bakery where she gazed longingly at the pastries placed in the window. The streets were full of horses, with and without carriages. Newsboys proclaimed the urgency of the day's headlines. A cold wind undid my father's collar on one side and made it stick up like a wing, which embarrassed her. On Market Street, they entered a 5-story building and began climbing the stairs. At the third landing, my father stopped to catch his breath. I've been doing a great deal of thinking, he said. He swabbed his face with a handkerchief and took the next flight 2 steps at a time. She hastened after him, trying not to jostle me, because although my eyes were still closed, I was beginning to move restlessly. I was prone to cry and, according to Corelia, had lungs of unusual capacity. We burst into the photographic studio of Devereaux and Grant. The receptionist, Mrs. Ruthinger, was showing a young couple a selection of frames and didn't look up until my father had already hurried past her desk. She called in her deep frog-like voice, "Who is your appointment with, sir?" When he turned, she seemed amazed to recognize my father. "Mr. Kylander, I beg your pardon, we weren't expecting you. Your room is in use. Mr. Billings is at work." "Who is Mr. Billings?" "A freelance photographer," she said. "Mr. Devereaux brought him in to handle your clients." "I need my room as soon as he is done," he said. Mrs. Ruthinger extended her open hand in the direction of the couple who had been looking at frames, and who were now watching the interchange with much curiosity. She said, "They are scheduled for a 4 o'clock appointment with Mr. Billings." The young woman, who had been smiling fondly at me, said, "We don't mind waiting a bit. How old is he?" Corelia wondered if they thought that I was her child and that she was my father's wife. 5 years old, she said, to flummox them. The couple stared at the tiny booty on my foot kicking up and down. "He's very small for his age," she added. They asked no more questions. The door to my father's studio opened, and out came a husky man with wire-rimmed spectacles that seemed too small for his face. "Mrs. Ruthinger will show you the size of prints we offer," he was saying to the elderly woman following him. "I'm sure you'll find something satisfactory." "I'm Arthur Kylander," my father said, "and I need my studio for half an hour." He shook Mr. Billings's hand and beckoned to Corelia. She hurried after him. But no sooner had she reached the door than she ran into him, because he had stopped still. "What's all this clutter?" he said. A large backdrop of a meadow rested on a carpet of artificial grass. In the corner of the room stood Greek columns, 2 papier-mâché boulders, and a rustic-looking fence. Several other painted landscapes leaned against the wall. "I find that customers appreciate a variety of backdrops," Mr. Billings said. "I know what their purpose is," said my father, "and they have nothing to do with portraits. For God's sake, The woman you just photographed likely hasn't set foot in a meadow in years. If people insist on being photographed with a meadow behind them, take them to a real one. Remove these items." Mr. Devereux emerged from his office. "Arthur, what are you doing here? My deepest condolences about your wife." He paused. "You are well, I trust? Are you evicting Mr. Billings?" "I'm evicting his paraphernalia," my father said. "It's all right," said Mr. Billings. "I'm happy to remove it for the moment, Mr. Devereux, happy to be accommodating." Mr. Devereux possessed the most neatly trimmed beard Corellia had ever seen, silvery and coming to a point so sharp it might cut glass. He regarded my father in astonishment. "But Arthur, are you sure you are well enough yet?" "Quite well," my father said. Behind him, Mr. Billings carried out a backdrop of the Alps. Mr. Devereux's eye twitched, but he said nothing. Soon Mr. Billings had removed all his props, and with a bow and a flourish, directed my father and Corellia into the studio. By this time, Corellia felt self-conscious. She had never been inside a portrait studio, and although she had been living in our flat for a month, she hadn't had time to get used to my father. She had only seen him in his melancholic state. My father placed a chair for her in front of the plain backdrop that he always used, and motioned for her to sit. Mr. Billings had left behind a papier-mâché boulder, which my father shoved into the corner. By this time, I was awake. But although I jerked my head around solemnly at the unfamiliar surroundings, I hadn't yet decided to cry. "Why did you bring us here?" Corellia asked my father. "To take a portrait." He removed the lens of the camera and began to focus on her. She hadn't been expecting to have her own photograph taken. No one had ever photographed her. She looked down at her dress, a patched, worn thing the Hodgders had given her. She hadn't even had the chance to brush her hair. Yet she feared that if she asked for a brush, my father would think her vain. Surely he would offer her one. As he focused the camera and adjusted the shades that let light into the room, he spoke to her. "I wish photographers wouldn't turn their studios into a theater stage. It's bad enough that people want us to retouch the negatives." Now Corellia knew he wouldn't think of offering her a brush. "The camera is an instrument of science," he said. "Muybridge showed us that." She watched my father cross the room and remove from a cabinet what looked like a long, flat box. After inserting this into the camera, he once again disappeared beneath the cloth. She had to stifle an urge to leap off the stool and run out of the room with me. "Hold him in the air in front of you so his legs hang down," he said. He gave her various instructions. "Higher, lower, turn the right side closer to me. Is it warm enough in here to undress the child?" When I was naked, he said, "Now hold him before you again, as straight on as possible." He studied them through the lens of his camera. "A half-inch lower." She did not like holding me this way, as if I were a prize fish being recorded for posterity, and I did not like it either. I kicked and squalled. Her arms were tired. She heard a click. Was it as simple as that? She'd imagined a professional photographer's equipment to be much more complicated, involving rods and levers. My father directed Corellia to turn me 45 degrees, so that he might photograph my right profile, then my back, then my left profile. "You may put him down now," he said, and she did so gratefully, her arms aching as she dressed me again. A knock came, and Mr. Devereux walked in. "Arthur, you've had your half hour and some extra. May I ask your intentions for the rest of the afternoon?" "I'm done for today," my father said, "and you can count on my return to work tomorrow morning. I'm invigorated by this project, which may well bring renown to the studio. I have an idea to extend Muybridge's work, to create the first scientific record of the development of the human body over time. I'd like Mrs. Ruthinger to clear a half hour in my schedule so I might repeat this session with my son and my niece each afternoon." "Each afternoon!" Corellia cried. Mr. Devereux went over to the windows and pulled up a shade, flooding the room with light. "Arthur, you know I grieve with you at the loss of your wife. At the same time, Mr. Billings is doing an excellent job with us. It is true that his approach is different from your own. I side with your aesthetic preferences here. But the customers are pleased with his work, and I feel I'm bound to allow him room to develop in his abilities. You have an excitable nature, Arthur, it wouldn't do for you to rush back into work. I believe the best course for you now is to consider yourself free from studio responsibilities at Devereux and Grant. Perhaps at some future point, after some months or even a year has passed, we may come to a new understanding. I see, said my father. Corelia, who had succeeded in calming me, watched him warily, wondering if he was about to start a row. Mr. Devereux had called him excitable, and since my father had lain in bed much of the time she had known him, she had no experience of her own to go on except for the events of the afternoon. My father stood in the middle of the room, frowning, as if mulling over Mr. Devereux's words. Please let me have 2 weeks, he said. Too much time has been lost already, and I can't afford any gaps in the sequence. And I ask for a half hour each afternoon at 3 o'clock to continue my project. I'll gladly shorten my lunch hour to make that up. I've worked for you for more than 4 years, Mr. Devereux. 2 more weeks. That would only be fair, wouldn't it? Mr. Devereux agreed with a sigh. My father shook Mr. Devereux's hand absently and motioned for Corelia to follow him out of the studio. Mr. Billings lurked by the door. He sprang back hastily, as if fearing my father might strike him. But my father seemed preoccupied with his own thoughts. Corelia felt the eyes of everyone in the waiting room. As I began to cry again, she tried to slow her step, so as not to appear to be hurrying obediently after my father. By the time my father and Corelia had returned from the studio, I had fallen asleep, my head burrowed under her chin. My father shut himself into a closet she had never seen open before since her arrival, his darkroom. When he emerged, he put before her what he called the best series of prints, one of each quadrant of my infant body. The left profile suffers from blur, he said. The dorsal view is slightly overexposed. Still, a fair start. Corelia was glad to see that my father had cropped the photographs tightly. Only her hands were visible, holding me up. But do I have to hold Joseph for the camera again? Corelia asked. Bring him to the studio at 3 o'clock each afternoon. Do you remember the way? For how many days? For as long as it takes for him to stand on his own. She considered a moment. I want something in return. I want to have drawing lessons. He looked at her in surprise. She expected him to say that drawing was a childish waste of time. But instead he said, of course, drawing is a useful way to train the eye. Thank you.